Hello, and welcome to another episode of Research Goes Live, the podcast by the University of Pannonia that focuses on the research of our doctoral students and discusses their importance and impact on our everyday lives. I am your host, Laszlo Gabor-Kotona, and today we are joined by Rayane Fernandes, a doctoral student from the Faculty of Engineering. Rayane, welcome. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, Laszlo. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here and talking about science. My name is Rayane. I'm from Brazil. I am an early career research scientist. I moved to Hungary in 2019 to do my PhD in Pannonia. I chose the university because of the line of research developed by the Limnology Research Group.
Well, tell us a little bit about the main focus of your research and the science behind it.
Of course, I work with phytoplankton ecology. There are microorganisms photosynthetic that they drift in the water. They can be found in oceans, lakes, rivers, and other water bodies. They are extremely important because they are main component of the base of the food chain in the aquatic ecosystems. So they are consumed by small aquatic animals. And then they're consumed by the bigger animals, so they produce the biomass in aquatic systems. And a very important one that not everybody knows, but they are responsible for more than 15% of the oxygen produced in the earth. Everybody thinks that comes from the trees, but 15% comes from the oceans. And my research is to try to understand the mechanisms regulating the phytoplankton in tropical and temperate regions, and also to understand the responses to environmental changes.
So this isn't really something that we tend to really think about all the time when we visit a lake. I've never gone to a lake and said, I wonder how much phytoplankton is in here today. How prevalent is phytoplankton in our immediate surroundings?
In a general form, basically anywhere.
Okay.
Like the plants, they do photosynthesis. So they take the nutrients in the water and they do photosynthesis and they produce their own food. So in mostly of the water bodies, you can find phytoplankton. But it's not all the same. It's a very diverse group with shapes and size, so you can find different types of phytoplankton related with the environment.
Okay, so it's not just one general type. So it's a whole group. And we're talking about just freshwater, correct?
The main focus of my research is freshwater, but they can be found in wetlands, they can be found in oceans, and most of the types of water bodies.
Got it. Okay. So from our previous discussions, what causes an overabundance of phytoplankton and what effects does it have on the surrounding environment?
You mean algal blooms?
Yes.
Yeah, this is a hot topic. As I said, like the plants, they take the nutrients and they use the sunlight. Of course, there is other factors that influence the growth of phytoplankton, but mainly sunlight and nutrients. So in a general form, if they need light and nutrients to grow, if you increase the concentration of nutrients and also you have prolonged periods of light, it's going to influence the phytoplankton overgrowth. When we talk about algal blooms, the main cause is basically the increase of nutrients in those water bodies as a consequence of human activity. And there's several consequences, but here I'm going to list three extremely important ones.
Okay.
First, when you have phytoplankton overgrowth, mostly of the times it's composed by cyanobacteria. That's another group. And this group, they produce toxins. And those toxins, they're very harmful for humans, for fishes, for wildlife, in general, most of organisms. And not only because of the toxins, but also because of some characteristics that cyanobacteria has. When they increase this huge biomass cannot be consumed by small fishes. So this huge biomass accumulated in the lakes and also the oceans, but in lakes the proportion is higher because you have low amount of water compared with the ocean.
Right.
And when there is the decomposition of those blooms, when the phytoplankton die and you have this decomposition, consumes the oxygen in the water faster that can be compensated by the photosynthesis, then you create these conditions without oxygens that can also be called dead zones, because leads to the death of several organisms that depend of the oxygen supply. So these are three important impacts that they have, but there is also several others.
I understand. And I think it's important that we're using the correct terminology. If I'm correct, it's not necessarily global warming, but it's rather climate change that can be listed as a cause. Is this correct?
Yes, of course. It's very tricky, right? Most of people associate climate changes and global warming as the same thing. They have the similarities, but it's not the same. So global warming, it's a symptom of climate changes. So climate changes is differences in the long term, not only in temperature, but also in weather conditions. So global warming is a symptom, but they're not only the same. Global warming is a symptom of climate change, but climate change has also other symptoms, such as the increase of extreme weather events. What we can observe is that we are having an increase in hurricanes and heavier storms, also prolonged droughts. So all of this, there are symptoms of climate changes. And global warming directly affects phytoplankton because of the temperature and the relation with the photosynthesis. But there are several studies that they're also associating some of those extreme weather events, such as example, extreme droughts. That's something that I study, associated with promoting the overgrowth of cyanobacteria.
So then how does this extreme drought lead to?
Okay, this is very good, and I can explain in a very simple way.
Okay.
So if you have a lake, you're going to think about a volume of water. If you have extreme drought, you're going to have the reduction of this water volume because it's not replaced, there is evapotranspiration, so the water is coming off, but it's not coming back. So if you have a concentration of nutrients and you take it off the volume of the water, you increase the concentration of nutrients. And with more nutrients, you have more phytoplankton overgrowth.
Okay, that's pretty understandable then. So where and how are you collecting samples? And also with that, what are some significant observations that you've made from these sample collections over an extended period of time?
It's a nice question because as I'm working with tropic and temperated regions, we do different type of collections because of the lakes. In the tropical region, I have been working with shallow lakes, and we do the collection in the first 2 meters of the surface. And in the temperated region, more specifically in Germany, because the water body is 65 meters depth, we have a specific sampling that we're taking water samples every 5 meters.
Okay.
For us to understand and to see phytoplankton, we do the sample collections, we do the monitoring. So we always see something different. It's very interesting because it's very diverse. It's actually very beautiful to look at it. And when we compare long term, we can actually observe the changes in the lakes. Because they are the base of the lake, they reflect very quickly any change. So when we are observing in long time, if the lake is passing for any different condition, extreme weather events, or you have the increase of nutrients, you're going to see the changing in the phytoplankton composition.
And how much phytoplankton development is a result of human intervention? So are we causing this?
Something that I think it's very important to say is that phytoplankton is there since always. And actually it's very good for us that phytoplankton is there because the fish that eat, they feed in the phytoplankton. So mostly of the biodiversity in the aquatic systems, they rely on the phytoplankton. And also the oxygen that we breathe. The point is, human activities changes some conditions, like the increasing of nutrients in the water bodies, that lead to this overgrowth of phytoplankton and cyanobacteria. The problem is anthropogenic activities, the human activity, such as the introduction of wastewater in lakes without treatment, also the increase of use of fertilizers, they increase the concentration of nutrients that leads to the increase of concentration of phytoplankton. So the important is we need to have this biodiverse community with a lot of phytoplankton living there, and not exactly only one that's So it's important that we can keep the biodiversity of phytoplankton, and when we have some these humans activities, they sometimes lead to the overgrowth of just one that has consequences for the ecosystem.
Okay, so even in one lake, we're not just talking about one type of phytoplankton.
No.
Okay.
It's important to think that phytoplankton is on the earth even long before us.
Yeah.
Cyanobacteria actually were the first oxygen organisms. So they have like a very short lifespan, such as 3 days. So they had this long time to evolve. So you have the most diverse one. This is the reason sometimes we can find phytoplankton in very extreme places that you don't expect to have life there, and you still have them existing.
It's had enough time to evolve.
Yeah.
It's had enough time to evolve. We can also say we all have a little phytoplankton in us, I guess, from the consuming of fish that also feed on the phytoplankton. Obviously not directly, that would be creepy.
Yeah, but we can say like, yeah, if you think about it, we not phytoplankton itself, yes, but like we eat algae.
Yeah, yes we do.
Yeah.
Yes we do. So what, if anything, can be done to mitigate negative human behavior that leads to an overabundance of nutrients in the lakes?
So the first one would be to avoid it to the entrance of those nutrients in the water. It's to control all these activities that they result in the entrance of nutrients in the water. But if the nutrients are already there, you have 3 types of mitigations that you can use. You can use physical, so you can do the removing of the sediment of the lake to try to remove the nutrients. Or if the phytoplankton, there is already a bloom, an overgrowth there, you can remove this mass. So you have the chemical one, when you insert a chemical there, and they're going to bond with the nutrients, and they're going to make unavailable for the phytoplankton. And you also have the biological one. That's when you're going to include, as example, microphytes, that they're going to remove the nutrients in the water. So it's very depending on the lake and the case, but you have those 3 types. Sometimes you can use them combined to have a better result.
Out of curiosity, another way that I guess we can mitigate negative human behaviors, is there any other place where they can put this water runoff from fertilizers, from detergents, so that it doesn't make it into the lake? Is this what you mentioned with water treatment, to make sure that it's properly treated first before it goes into the lake?
For wastewater treatment, of course, actually you're obligated by law to treat the water before it goes to the lake. But with farming, it's a little bit more tricky, because when you fertilize your crops, the runoff of the excess of those fertilizers go to the lakes. There are several mitigations biological that we try to do, or increasing the vegetation in the surroundings to work a little bit as a buffer zone, but it doesn't actually prevent or stop. Actually, what would stop is to have the use of fertilizer more regulated, that can be less excess going to the water.
It's essentially stopping or regulating the problem before it becomes a problem.
Yeah, it's so easy when you talk like this, and for me it's also so obvious. There are actually some studies from United States, by the way, that they are doing the calculation of the cost for you to prevent and the cost for you to treat. The cost for you to treat is a lot higher than actually preventing. But it's also important to always think that it's a very complex system. So the aquatic system, it's not isolated from the terrestrial system. So they're all together. So we need to have open eye on those situations. And I think this podcast is very nice also for this, to actually put this notion in people's mind so we can be more aware and we can pay more attention on the regulations and how our water is being treated and the conditions and everything.
Yeah, that's very true. This is a good opportunity just to essentially remind our listeners as well. It's not just in healthcare that prevention can be cheaper than treatment, but it's also in environmental issues and also in our freshwater systems and in our lakes. So how capable are lakes of adjusting and changing themselves, or do humans have to be involved?
I always think it's very important to mention that the lakes exist long before us, and the lake works as organisms, as us. So we are capable for taking changes and still existing, and also as the lakes. The lakes are resilient. They can take changes and not change the function and everything. So you have those limits of changes that the lake can take it. After that, they're going to shift to a new condition. They're going to still existing, but not producing the things that we so much need.
Such as what?
Such as the fish that you eat. And sometimes we think about services only as food, oxygen, and all those things, but also you for going for a swim.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you're going to miss it, right?
Yes, I would.
So the human intervention became necessary because the humans started to lose the function and the services from the lakes. This is why they started to actually, okay, it's not working as we want, as we are used to. So now let's try to bring it back. But as I said, it's a very complex system with several mechanisms working together. So it's very hard for you to bring to the state that once was.
Yeah, so it's not always about let's return it to exactly what we had before, but it's really about how can we make sure that it doesn't cross a threshold, that it gets to the point where it's so bad that it changes something that we really need.
Yeah, when we talk like this, we expect like drastic changes. That one day the lake is going to have no life, but it's not exactly like this. Those changes, they are very small and they are happening. This is why we monitor those lakes for such long times, to try to understand all those changes. And this point of threshold, it's very tricky, because can you think about each mechanisms that work in a lake, they have a threshold. And when you put it all in together, they can interact with each other. And then if you change a little bit the position in the geographical location, a completely different system exists. So it's very hard for you to find this threshold. It's the reason why we always trying to monitor these small changes and try to understand what is happening to actually prevent that big change happen.
And I think that's important to mention, because too often, and I think even for speaking for myself or even the audience, we will hear about freshwater lakes and we will assume, yes, freshwater lakes, all the same. And they're not, because as you mentioned, based on geographical location, based on certain conditions in the area, even the type of life that exists in the water, they're very, very different.
Yeah, and actually the type of life that there is in the water, it's a little bit of the consequence of those differences in the lakes, like the morphometry, the type of water, the temperature. So the organisms that are going to exist there, they are depending on the conditions there.
Yeah. And that's fascinating, because now I think back to there's a thermal lake here in Hungary, Havíz, which is down at just past the southern shores of Lake Balaton. And they have a completely different ecosystem. It can't be found anywhere else. And so now it makes more sense after having this conversation. So what impact will your research have on our everyday lives?
On my first class in Pannonia Universe, My supervisor, Professor Judith Padzak, she said something for me that stuck with me.
Mhm.
The job of a PhD research is to provide knowledge. A lot of times people come to me and like, what is the application? But how we are going to solve it and everything. But sometimes people misses the importance of the knowledge. So on my research, I evaluate phytoplankton response to anthropogenic changes in the temperated and tropical regions. So we try to understand the main factors influence them in those different conditions. For us to actually develop correct mitigation in this so complex web of mechanisms, we need to understand very well the main factors, how they're influencing, how the phytoplankton responds. So my research provides knowledge that they can be used to create those mitigations, to understand, and not only mitigation, I still like the part of preventing and just understanding how important they are, so then we can preserve them as they are.
Right. The job of the PhD student is to essentially identify and point out the problem, provide that knowledge, and then the application portion is another group, is somebody else.
Actually, you can have a PhD student that's actually doing applied
Yes.
methodology, but when we talk about science, sometimes people expect you to come with the answer, like, okay, the problem is this, I understood the problem, and this is the answer. But this is a group of scientists working together. When I did my research, I did several research back to support mine. So it's a little bit of like this really huge web of interactions in the science.
And I think I just found my the next thing that I'm going to tell my wife is that, my job is really just to provide the information on what needs to be done. I can't always be responsible for with fixing it. No, that won't go well. Just saying. I gotta provide both. No, this is actually really good because a lot of times you are correct. That is what happens. Great, you told us what is the problem. Why aren't you also solving it? Why aren't you bringing the solution right away? And it's not that simple. And it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, this is something that I sometimes try to talk because when we are talking like now, we are talking very generalized, look like very simple. In the reality, not that much, but we try to.
Right, absolutely. Now, from your research, is there anything new or anything, a new topic that you want to investigate because of what you've researched so far?
Part of my PhD, I started to work with machine learning. Have you ever heard?
Yes.
So what I did is I provided several informations to the model, and I'm trying to answer in different ways old problems. So I apply it to try to understand the environmental thresholders, to try to I apply this to understand the environmental thresholders associated with the dominance of phytoplankton groups with determined conditions. So this is something that I very like. It's use new technologies and new ways to try to understand and to answer not so new problems, but have a different perspective.
Well, this is pretty fascinating because now we're also talking about the idea of bringing in machine learning, essentially artificial intelligence, to process the data and possibly point out new topics and new fields of research. Rayane, this was a really great conversation. This was really informative. I think it opened up my eyes as well to certain things that were around me that I thought were one way, especially when it came to this whole idea of classifying freshwater lakes. And really realizing that each one, every single one, this is like we're talking about snowflakes, each one is really unique and really diverse in how this affects our everyday lives. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It was actually a very nice pleasure to be here and talk a little bit about my research. So I'm glad that you could see a different side, and I hope that the listeners too, and looking forward to come back.
And also a reminder to everyone to make sure you join us next time for our next presentation. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe.